In the third anniversary of my marriage to him, I discovered an old blog entry he had authored. In that post, he recounted how he and his first love had been separated by circumstances beyond their control, forcing him to marry the daughter of our next door neighbors, who had harbored feelings for him over the years. Coincidentally, I was that neighbor's daughter, a tragic obstacle in a love story, standing in the way of the protagonist and his true love. The drama began when I visited his workplace to see Evan. As the elevator doors slid open, the first thing I heard was yelling, accompanied by the sound of fists striking flesh. It was Evan's mother's voice. "Evan is married. Why are you back? Your mother took Evan's father away. Are you here to take my son too? You insolent woman!" This was the first time I had seen Evan's usually composed mother lose her temper like that. Evan was holding someone tightly in his arms, as if guarding a precious treasure. I tried to call his name, but someone suddenly shoved me. My arm struck the edge of a table, and my words turned into a cry of pain and astonishment. Evan glanced at me, quickly releasing the person he was holding, seemingly intending to help me. But then he noticed his mother picking up a small potted plant. Without a second thought, he turned back to protect the girl once more. The pot hit his head directly, and blood began to trickle down his face. The surrounding noises became increasingly chaotic. I heard Evan's mother desperately calling his name. "Evan!" The girl in his arms was sobbing. "Are you all right, Evan?" Evan, with a voice barely above a whisper, replied, "As long as you're okay." The commotion culminated with Evan losing consciousness and being rushed to the hospital. Before I left, he held my hand and softly whispered my name one last time. Lila. Evan's mother promised to explain everything at home and instructed me to visit the hospital to check on Evan. By the time I arrived, evening had settled in. Evan's friend Marcus was waiting by the door of the hospital room. As soon as he saw me, he began to speak, but I grabbed his wrist firmly, silencing him. The door to the room was slightly open, and I could hear a girl's playful pleas inside. "Just take a bite. I made it especially for you." Evan sighed softly. "Sophia, you don't have to." Before he could continue, the young girl's eyes welled up with tears, making her appear so fragile and sorrowful. Evan ceased speaking and obediently took the spoonful of porridge she offered. I didn't miss the fleeting look of pain on his face. He had been hurt. Sophia didn't seem like someone who knew how to care for others. Marcus tugged at my shirt with his free hand, his face downcast. I released his wrist, noticing a red mark had already appeared. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," he replied. "She's Evan's." "I know." He hesitated for a moment, as if about to say more, but the voices in the room grew louder. Sophia seemed to be crying. "I'm only here because I can't stop worrying about you. You got hurt because of me. Don't I even have the right to care for you, Evan? We clearly loved each other so much." The sound of rustling fabric indicated Evan was holding her. Their voices softened again, like whispers between lovers. "Lila." Marcus called my name gently. "Don't cry." I touched my cheek, tears streaming down. "How embarrassing." I lowered my head, covering my eyes. "I'll leave now." Evan and I had a whirlwind wedding 3 years prior. I had just graduated and returned to the country, and my parents hosted a welcome home party. Evan had driven to pick me up. Even the soothing instrumental music in the car couldn't ease the awkwardness of not seeing each other for 3 years, nor the nervousness of being alone with someone I had secretly loved for so long. We chatted intermittently during the drive, but as we neared our destination, my seatbelt suddenly jammed. I fumbled with it, flustered. Evan chuckled, leaned over, and unbuckled it, for me. The faint scent of cedar lingered around me. My body stiffened. Evan looked up, noticing my reaction, and gently tousled my hair. "It's only been a few years. Why are you so distant now? Didn't you say you wanted to marry me when you were little?" Evan rarely joked like that. My face flushed crimson, and my heart pounded in my chest. This surreal feeling lasted throughout the entire party until he, holding flowers, confessed his feelings in front of both our families under the dazzling lights. The young man I had cherished for over a decade, his eyes bright and his smile warm, said, "I've waited so long for you to come back, Lila. It felt like a dream I had often imagined as a child had suddenly come true. At that moment, I believed I must be the happiest person alive. Our married life was blissful. Evan was incredibly attentive. He cared for me during my periods, stayed by my side when I was ill, and constantly looked out for me in everyday life. I admired how well he treated me and wanted to reciprocate even more. It was only later that I discovered he had developed that patience and kindness gradually for Sophia. If it weren't for a friend who came across his blog post and shared it with me, I might have remained oblivious. I've fallen for my dad's mistress's daughter. What should I do? I know I shouldn't, but I can't control my feelings. She's so sweet, almost childlike. She always hugs me, saying she wants to be with me forever. When my mom found out, she wouldn't let us be together. When I stayed with William, my mom threatened to end her life to separate us. I don't want to hurt my mom, but I also don't want William to be sad either. Are you crazy? Imagine how much your mom must be hurting. I support you. Why should love be torn apart? My mom pushed too hard. She held a knife asking me if I wanted William or her. In that moment, I realized how much older my mom looked. I couldn't defy her. What about William? Didn't you say you wanted to be with him forever? Stop hurting your mom. I ended my relationship with William. My mom still wasn't satisfied. She pushed me to marry quickly. The neighbor's daughter was returning from studying abroad. We grew up together, and her mother often mentioned liking me. My mom insisted I marry her. I proposed to the neighbor's daughter. What are you doing? Now you've hurt someone else. What about William? She's the one you've hurt the most. The blog post concluded with a response to a question. I got married that day. I'm now someone else's husband. Someone asked, what about William? Do you still love him? He answered, yes. The date of that response was July 14th at 10:15 a.m., the morning of my wedding to Evan. At 10 a.m., I was sitting in my room, dressed in a beautiful wedding gown, makeup flawless. My best friend stood by the door, ready for the groom to arrive. At that moment, I thought I was finally marrying the man I had loved for 10 years. How wonderful. That night, Evan never came home. By the time I finished reading the post, my face was soaked with tears, and the air in the room felt thin, leaving me gasping for breath. I considered stepping outside to the garden for some fresh air. Among the swaying shadows of the trees, I saw a familiar figure in the distance. Evan was standing under a streetlight with Sophia looking up at him, the two close together. Sophia, we can't do this anymore. I'm already married. She's a good person. I can't hurt her. The dim light softened Sophia's face. She looked like she was about to cry, but tried to hold it in, pretending to be strong. I know. I just can't forget you. That's why I came back. Just working at your company, seeing you every day, that's enough. I shouldn't want more. Evan, I'll keep myself in check. He replied, his last words jumbled. The instant Sophia's tears began to fall, I saw the deep pain in Evan's eyes, unmistakable. Before he realized it, he had already pulled Sophia into his arms to comfort her. It was such a familiar sight because when I cried, he held me just like that many times. He would gently wipe away my tears and soothe me. Every time I felt down, Evan would give me a gift afterward, like I was a child. I always said, there's no need for that next time. He'd just hold me and smile gently. If it makes you happy, I'll do anything. The wind whispered in my ears, but I could still hear my own heart breaking. That day, I went from desperately wanting to confront Evan to crying alone until I couldn't hold it in anymore. Finally, I chose a different path, letting them be happy together. But the world isn't that kind. When I left the hospital, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to my parents' house. My mom looked surprised when she opened the door, then smiled. What brings you here all of a sudden? I forced a smile. Just missed you guys, that's all. My mom glanced behind me. Where's Evan? Didn't he come with you? He's in the hospital. What? He's in the hospital? What happened? He hit his head, but the doctor said it's nothing serious. I omitted the part about Evan's mother. Why aren't you with him? My mom smiled turned a bit sly. She had always been perceptive, seeing through my feelings for Evan, but pretending not to know while subtly encouraging me towards him whenever possible. After all these years of longing, you finally got what you wanted. Hold on tight, okay? No, it's not that. It's far from getting what I wanted. I only just realized what I thought was good fortune was just Evan settling for someone since he couldn't marry the one he truly loved. I've liked Evan ever since I was little. My parents were always busy. When Evan came home from school and found me waiting for my parents by the door, he'd take me in, help me with my homework, or watch cartoons with me. That night, my parents never returned. I fell asleep in his room while reading comics, only to wake up to a thunderstorm outside. I had a nightmare and was terrified by the thunder, crying for my parents. Evan rushed in from the next room, even losing a slipper along the way. Lila? My face was covered in tears and snot, and Evan couldn't hold back a laugh. He grabbed a wet towel to wipe my face, comforting me as he cleaned me up. It's okay, it's okay. It was just a dream. But the more he comforted me, the harder I cried. Eventually, I cried myself to sleep, holding Evan's hand. I remember him standing beside the bed, saying he'd stay with me. Will you always stay with me? I will. Will you stay with me forever and ever? I will. I knew even then that words said casually aren't always trustworthy, but if feelings could be controlled, I wouldn't have fallen for him, chasing him like a moth to a flame for so many years. I didn't visit Evan at the hospital again. When he asked, I simply said I was at my parents' house. His head injury wasn't serious. He was discharged within a few days. It happened to be New Year's Day when he came to pick me up for dinner at home. He stood by the door, tall and graceful, his face lighting up with a smile when he saw me. Lila, you look beautiful today. Evan never held back on compliments. In the past, I'd be embarrassed. But over time, I grew more confident and liked him even more. I lowered my gaze, avoiding his eyes. Let's go. Evan paused for a moment, then politely said goodbye to my parents. Evan's mom had calmed down by then, returning to her usual gentle self. She didn't want to discuss the day's incident, and I pretended to have forgotten as well. She looked happy to see me taking my hand. Lila, I bought some necklaces and bracelets for you. Come try them on. The kitchen is in good hands with the guys. Evan hung up my coat, smiling. You go ahead. The jewelry Evan's mom bought sparkled under the lights, almost blindingly bright. She helped me try on each piece, complimenting. So perfect. After the last piece, dinner was ready. The atmosphere at the table was warm, but it felt slightly off, like something was hidden. Everyone seemed to be concealing something. The moment the doorbell rang, I moved faster than Evan and opened the door. Standing outside was an unexpected guest, Sophia. It looked like Sophia had hurried over, her forehead slightly damp with sweat. In the brief moment I stood there in shock, Evan had already come over. Lila. The second Sophia saw him behind me, her tears fell. Where did you go? You got discharged without telling me. Do you know how worried I was? I turned to look at Evan. He maintained a calm facade, clearing his throat lightly. Evan, who is she? Evan didn't answer. Sophia pushed past me, rushing over to him. At the table, Evan's parents had noticed her too. I saw the look on his mother's face change instantly. You. But Evan's father, sitting beside her, quickly grabbed her shoulder. She's my friend's daughter. She used to be good friends with Evan. Is that so? I smiled. I've known Evan for over 10 years. I don't think I've ever met her. He met her during those years you were studying abroad. I smiled again, letting his lie slide. Well, since you're here, join us for dinner. Evan's dad added a bowl and chair for Sophia. It was supposed to be a family reunion, but an outsider suddenly appeared. Sophia sat beside Evan and, right in front of his mom, kept piling food onto his plate affectionately. When she picked up another mushroom to place in his bowl, I stopped her. He doesn't like that. I looked at Sophia calmly, taking away the carrot she'd intended to give him as well. He's allergic to carrots. Sophia's smile froze instantly. The atmosphere grew tense. It's fine, Evan suddenly spoke up, breaking the awkward silence. As if to prove he really didn't mind, he picked up a shrimp for Sophia. Just like that post mentioned, Sophia's favorite food. Sophia's embarrassment faded, replaced by joy. You still remember what I love. Evan seemed to realize something and picked up food for me too. Lila, try this. It's good. But I didn't like it. I preferred salt and pepper, braised or grilled. Anything but plain boiled. I watched as Sophia dipped the shrimp in sauce, biting in with a look of bliss on her face, and then it hit me. The favored ones always have the privilege to take things for granted, just like Evan with Sophia. Just like me with Evan. Suddenly, the food in my mouth felt hard to swallow, and I lost my appetite entirely. I have something to do tonight. I'll head out now. Where to? Need a ride? Evan asked. I looked at him, my peripheral vision catching Sophia's hand, slowly covering his under the table. No, that's okay. I stood up and left immediately, calling a friend to go out drinking. Half drunk, I looked hazily at Anna as she propped her chin on her hand and asked, "What's up? Something bothering you lately?" I stayed silent, downing drink after drink. Work's going well, you're gorgeous, and your husband's the guy you've had a crush on for years. Life seems perfect. Lila, with your life set up, if you're not the epitome of success, you're at least fate's favorite. So what's bothering you? I couldn't bring myself to say it. Anna didn't press, just kept me company, in my quiet drinking. I ended up hugging the toilet and vomiting twice in the bathroom. So drunk I was out of it. Knowing nothing else to do, Anna called Evan. When Evan came to the bar to pick me up, I stood like a statue under the lamppost by the entrance. But the moment I saw him, my tears began to fall. Evan paused, surprised, and pulled a tissue from his pocket. As he wiped my tears, I didn't avoid his touch, just stared at him blankly. You look a lot like someone I like, I said. Evan chuckled softly. Oh? What's his name? Evan. He burst into a smile, one that bloomed like a night flower in the dark. I looked at him, my mind swimming with dizziness. Do you know something? I've liked him for so long. I just never dared to tell him. How long is so long? What year is it again? I asked. Evan named the year, and I counted on my fingers repeatedly until I finally had it. 10 years. The light from above cast a soft glow on Evan's tousled hair, making it look almost translucent. His beautiful face froze. You don't believe me? I asked. He shook his head, annoyed. I grabbed my phone and opened my private album. Still tipsy, I fumbled with the password, entering it incorrectly several times. The question was from years ago. Who do you like? Such a silly question from my teenage years. I typed in 2 letters. A much younger Evan's face appeared in the photo. Look at this, I said, tapping on a picture. I found it on the school's website. The photo captured Evan in the final sprint of a long-distance run. I zoomed in and found myself pushed into the crowd. He was running, and I wanted to give him water, but there were too many people. I couldn't get close. And in the end, he took water from another girl. I sighed. That moment really stung. But later, when I found this photo on the school website, it made me feel better. Even though I couldn't give him the water, we were in the same frame. I laughed, remembering how I'd clutched that water bottle all day like an idiot, just as if I'd bought my favorite cake only to find it squished on the way home. I had been crushed, but the moment I saw this photo, I felt alive again. At least I was captured in that moment of his victory. And this one? I showed him another photo. I found it in my mom's album. It was from my 10th birthday, when Evan had come to celebrate with me. We held hands performing for the adults. Evan wore a tiny suit, and I had on a fluffy dress, just like a little couple. I even used it as my profile background, I told him. My friends kept saying I looked so cute as a kid. I wondered if he had ever seen it, what he'd think. Would I lie and say it's just because the photo is cute, or just admit because I wanted you to see it, or because I like you? But he never did. He never noticed. 10 years is such a long time. These little things I've kept inside for so long, they're so clear in my mind. They're endless. In the end, my mouth was dry, but I couldn't finish all my thoughts about this decade-long crush. And when I finished, suddenly he pulled me into his arms. Evan's embrace was warm, not just through his clothes, but in the heartbeat and the soft rhythm of his emotions beneath them. He held me so tightly. His hand trembled slightly. I love you. His breath landed softly by my ear, warm with a slight catch in his voice. Lila, I love you too. In Evan's arms, my face was dry, and the cold wind sobered me up considerably. I looked up into the blinding white light above for a long, long time. Then I spoke softly. Liar. Evan, you're such a liar. When I woke up, my head was splitting. Evan heard me stir and appeared at the bedroom door. Lila, I made you some hangover soup. I rubbed my temples and nodded. After freshening up, I went to the dining table where breakfast and the soup were ready. I downed the soup in one go, only to find he'd left a piece of candy beside it. Lila? Evan came down the stairs, holding a tie, smiling at me. I paused, then took the tie and helped him put it on. Evan took the opportunity to lean down and kiss my forehead, murmuring sweetly in my ear, "Wait for me to come back." Just like when we were newlyweds. I was lost in thought for a moment, and by the time I snapped out of it, Evan was already gone. Not long after he left, a call from an unknown number came through. I answered it, and the voice on the other end sounded familiar. It was Sophia. She wanted to meet up. On the way, I thought about all the ways Sophia might start the conversation. Maybe like a character in a novel, she'd arrogantly declare, "He only loves me." Or perhaps she'd tell me to back off, but she didn't. Sophia had arrived before me. When we met, she greeted me and began telling me about her and Evan. I was with Evan for 2 years, and he was always so good to me. I actually always knew who he was. When I was young, I envied him. He had a happy family. His parents adored him. My mom never cared about me, not until she met Evan's father. Sometimes he'd visit, bringing me little gifts, but I knew it was only because he loved my mom. Until I started dating Evan. He's so caring, always worried if I was eating well, sleeping soundly. He'd tell me, "Don't worry, I'm here," and solve all my problems. It felt like he was a gift from heaven to make up for all the neglect I'd endured. I thought we'd be together forever until his mother found out. Her voice trembled as she continued, her tone filled with sudden desperation. He gave up on me. Her gaze shifted to me, her voice softening with sorrow. "Please, could you give him back to me? Please. I really love him." Tears streamed down her face, landing on the table. She was sobbing, yet she still carried herself with the pride of someone who had once been loved. I said nothing, just touched my own chest. "But it doesn't hurt like before." "Why don't you just tell Evan?" I asked. "Ask him to leave me and be with you." Sophia was stunned, a tear frozen on her lashes. I don't want to put him in that position." I smiled, looking at her calmly. "Do you really love Evan?" "Yes," she answered firmly, but I laughed. "Then tell me, what's Evan's favorite food?" Sophia fell silent, her mouth opening and closing, unable to utter a word. If you were so in love, why was one hesitating and the other so unaware? Maybe my laughter had provoked her, for Sophia's expression shifted from softness to anger. "Lila, if you insist on doing this, don't blame me. He'll never let me go." Sophia wasn't just talking. When Evan came home late from work, I noticed the faint peachy scent I'd once smelled on her. I was curled up on the sofa, watching an anime. Evan changed his shoes and tried to hug me. I dodged. On screen, the female lead was confessing to the male lead, who hesitated. She asked if he loved her. I looked over at Evan. He was gazing at me, eyes holding only me. Just like when we were kids, and he'd sit with me after school, watching anime as I did my homework. "Evan," I spoke seriously, "I always thought if I got married, it would be to someone I love." Evan smiled, bending down to scoop me up from the sofa. He looked up at me, his gaze sincere. "Lila, I already married the one I love." I lowered my gaze. "Liar." Sophia hasn't disappeared from my world, even though Evan tries his best to keep things calm on the surface, but she's becoming more and more outrageous. In the middle of the night, Evan's phone rang, waking me from my sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw him hurriedly putting on his clothes. Noticing that I was awake, he looked apologetic. "Sorry, Lila. I didn't mean to wake you. I have to go out for a bit, he said, adding, just go back to sleep. I nodded, lying in bed, watching as he left the room. Downstairs, I heard the door close with a bang. Now fully awake, I realized I had overheard something. She was crying softly, her tone fragile, saying there was someone outside her room, knocking on her door and window. I'm so scared, she said. Evan, could you come stay with me? I'm really afraid. Even a child knows that when you're in trouble, you call the police. But she chose to call someone else's husband. The day the weather forecast predicted the first snow, Evan and I had made dinner plans. When I went to his office at noon to meet him, he looked hesitant. Evan? I asked. Today I have a friend visiting from abroad. I haven't seen them in years, he said. I might not be able to make it tonight. That's fine, I replied. Evan smiled, but I could sense relief on his face. I'll pick you up tonight. Where will you be? He asked. I gave him an address and he nodded. I headed to a restaurant downtown, by the floor-to-ceiling windows. A pianist played in the main hall, the music flowing like a gentle stream. Although it had been years, my friend Emma and I picked up right where we left off, chatting nonstop over our meal. As evening fell, snow began to drift down in soft flakes. Emma looked outside with delight. I just got back and it's already snowing. My luck is amazing, she exclaimed. I smiled and glanced out over the square. There were quite a few people walking along the streets and several couples holding hands. Amid the falling snow, a girl suddenly leaned in and kissed her boyfriend. Watching them, I froze. The restaurant was warm, yet I suddenly felt as if I were plunged into ice, my whole body stiffening. What's wrong? Emma followed my gaze. When she saw the kissing couple, her expression softened with understanding, and she laughed. They say that couples who kiss on the first snow will be happy together forever, she teased. Lila, are you missing your husband? She asked. Thank you for spending such a romantic evening with me. I fell silent, my gaze lingering on the affectionate couple as they finally parted, arm in arm, strolling down the snowy street. After a long pause, I said, That's my husband. I saw Evan's message when I landed. I had missed several calls and unread messages. Judging by the timing, it was likely the middle of the night back home. In the past, he'd always get anxious when he couldn't reach me. I had applied for this business trip right after saying goodbye to Emma, without even packing, so I knew I wouldn't be home for a while. I replied to Evan, letting him know I was on a business trip. His response came instantly, That's good, come back soon. But Sophia was quicker than I expected. The very next day, she sent me a photo, a mirror selfie in our bathroom, wrapped in a towel. I quickly saved it before she deleted it. Stop wasting your energy. I'm not going to ask for a divorce. You'd be better off putting in the effort with Evan. By the time the project wrapped up, more than 2 weeks had passed. My life was gradually returning to normal. On the day I flew back, Evan was at the airport to pick me up. We hadn't seen each other in weeks, yet it felt as if a thick wall stood between us. He did most of the talking during the drive, while I replied absent-mindedly, focused on my phone, responding to messages from colleagues. Lila, Evan's voice was hesitant. Is there anything that's been bothering you lately? I was just about to answer when his phone rang unexpectedly and he accidentally hit speaker. In the confined space of the car, Sophia's voice came through clearly, slurring slightly as she murmured Evan's name. Evan, I'm at the bar and I think I drank too much. Could you come pick me up? My head's spinning, my legs feel weak, and someone keeps staring at me. When I looked up, I caught Evan's tense expression in the rearview mirror. Sorry, he started. Go ahead, I interrupted, meeting his tense expression in the mirror calmly. Sorry, he began again. Go ahead, I repeated, meeting his gaze calmly. Lila? Evan tried to explain. I know, a friend's daughter. I replied flatly. I opened the car door and got out. I need to stop by the office anyway. Go pick her up. Evan returned sooner than I expected, just as I finished moving my belongings from the master bedroom to the guest room. Lila, I dropped her off and came back right away. What are you doing? He asked, bewildered. I'm moving out, I replied. I haven't been sleeping well lately. We became busier with work. often coming home late. Evan would wait up, keeping the lights on until I returned. Each time I walked through the door, he'd ask, "Are you hungry? Do you want a late night snack?" I'd shake my head and head straight to my room without chatting. I could feel Evan's gaze on my back, confused and a bit hurt, but I had no desire to expend any more energy on him or Sophia. This continued until we attended a banquet together. I clung to his arm, mingling with the guests. Thanks to him, I met some potential clients. Introducing me, he would say, "This is my wife." People would compliment us, saying we made a great couple, and I'd lean slightly on his shoulder, smiling shyly. "You two look so in love," someone commented. I just smiled. After the banquet, as soon as we got in the car, I pulled my hand away from Evan's arm. He looked bewildered, his hand frozen midair. "Lila," he murmured. But when he saw my calm, indifferent expression, he fell silent. I leaned back against the car window, exhausted. "Why don't you sit in the front seat anymore?" he asked. I massaged my temples, giving a dismissive reply, "I just don't feel like it." The rest of the ride home was silent. I changed my shoes and headed to my room. "Lila," Evan's voice stopped me. "How's your insomnia? Has it gotten any better?" Without looking back, I answered, "No." Suddenly, he grabbed my hand tightly, his fingers trembling. "Lila." His voice was raw with desperation. "Please tell me what's wrong. Why did you start sleeping in a separate room as soon as you came back? Why are you coming home later and later? Why do you act affectionate in public, but won't even talk to me at home? Why? It's like you don't love me anymore. Let go." So, I spoke calmly, and he released his grip. My wrist was already reddened, and I rubbed it to ease the ache. "Is there something you'd like to admit?" I asked, looking him straight in the eye. "What?" he replied, confused. I held his gaze for a long moment. "Like," I said slowly, "kissing someone you love on the first snow is supposed to bring happiness forever?" Evan's face paled, his posture shrinking as he whispered, "You saw? Sophia had chosen the most conspicuous spot." "It was hard not to see," I replied, forcing a smile that was more painful than tears. "Evan," my voice was soft, but my words cut deep. "When I was drunk that night and told you I'd loved you for 10 years, you hugged me and said you loved me too. But is that the same feeling you had when you told someone online you loved Sophia 2 years ago?" "It's not the same," he protested. He quickly spoke up, trying to explain. I just, I smiled and closed the bedroom door in his face, not letting him finish. I no longer needed an answer. "Evan?" I never mentioned divorce to Evan. Instead, he was treating me better and clinging to me more than ever. He made breakfast before work, picked me up afterward, bought me flowers, my favorite treats, and all kinds of high-end gifts he thought I'd like. My colleagues would sometimes tease, "Lila, what's your secret to having such a loving husband?" I'd just smile. Sometimes when Sophia called, he'd subtly hang up on her. Sophia showed up one day out of nowhere. It was at that same cafe. This time, she lost all her composure, with none of the arrogant defiance she once had toward me. "What did you do?" Sophia stared me down, clutching her cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. I took a small sip of coffee and smiled at her. "I didn't do anything. All I did was remind him of how much I once loved him." And then I left. Why should I divorce him to give them what they wanted? Wouldn't it be better if he couldn't have me and she couldn't have him? "Lila, he doesn't love you. He loves me. Me." Sophia lost it, screaming at me, her voice loud but lacking real conviction. "Is that so?" I put down my coffee and stood up. "Then go convince Evan to divorce me. Can you do that, Sophia?" Evan invited me out for a Valentine's Day date. I agreed, choosing a restaurant that would be hard to forget. When Evan arrived, I saw a flash of anger in his face, but he quickly masked it. He set down a gift box. "I saw this a while ago. It suits you." "Thank you." I opened it to find an expensive pink diamond necklace. "Sorry, I've been so busy lately. I didn't have time to get you a gift sooner." "It's fine." Evan gave a warm, almost apologetic smile. "Just having you here today is the best gift." His words were cut off by red wine splashing down on him. His white shirt was stained, Red droplets fell from his hair onto the table, and I tapped my phone to start recording, aiming the camera at her. Evan. Sophia's wine glass shattered on the floor. Her voice was sharp and desperate. You're spending Valentine's Day with her. Why didn't you respond to my messages? Have you fallen for her? Tell me, is it true? Evan stayed silent, standing up to take a towel from a waiter and wiping the wine off his face. Curious onlookers surrounded us from all sides. I sat calmly in my seat, watching the spectacle. Sorry. Ignoring her, Evan turned to me. Lila, we had a bit of an incident. The waitstaff had already stepped in to stop Sophia. Don't be upset. I'll make it up to you. Lila? Sophia's eyes suddenly shifted to me. You planned this. You did this on purpose. You wanted me here just to make a fool of me. You planned this. You did this on purpose. You wanted me here just to make a fool of me. Her rage grew as she grabbed a bottle from the table and hurled it at me. In a flash, someone shielded me. The heavy thud of impact was unsettling. Evan had pulled me into his arms. I could hear his heartbeat pounding louder and louder, but my face remained expressionless. Sophia stood there, restrained, hands still in mid-throw. Evan turned around and slapped her, swift and forceful. I haven't changed my heart. Sophia, she's my wife. Gasps echoed from the crowd as someone muttered, calling Sophia insane. She dared to act out in front of the wife, knowing she was just the mistress. Sophia stared at Evan, her face pale, tears streaming down. The scene finally ended when the staff escorted her out. I had lost my appetite and Evan looked a mess, so we left. While waiting outside for a car, Evan apologized. Sorry, Lila, I wanted us to have a nice evening, but it ended up like this. If you're free, maybe we could try again tomorrow. I'm busy tomorrow, I cut him off. The air between us suddenly felt thin. I replayed a snippet of the recording. When I looked up, I found Evan watching me. The dark stain on his shirt still showed, and his hair hung down, casting his deep, upturned eyes in shadow. There was a hint of red at the corner of his eye, his voice breaking as he said, "Why aren't you angry?" I'd known Evan for over 20 years. I'd followed him around for more than 10. He'd always been calm, composed, and endlessly kind, like an older brother I could rely on. He took a step closer, grabbing my wrist gently, almost afraid to hold on too tightly. He loomed over me like a glass tower on the verge of collapse. She said you sent her the address? Lila, why aren't you angry? Can you blame me? Just once. Yell at me, hit me, argue with me. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Please. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and I felt a faint dampness. Please, Lila. Anything, just don't leave me. The late winter wind was still chilly on my face. I was enveloped in the scent of his cedar cologne. His hold was so tight. His warm breath crept down my collar, but I kept my stiff, unmoving posture, like a mannequin. Evan refused to let go. I knew he was waiting for me to say something, but I stayed silent. The next morning, Evan acted as if nothing had happened, getting up early to make me breakfast. I was in a hurry and didn't eat it. After I got to work, he sent me breakfast delivery. When my colleague came into my office, she looked over and said, Lila, can you even finish all this? I smiled and asked, Hungry? Want some? Her eyes lit up. Thanks, Lila. As she reached for it, she noticed a note attached to the box. Evan had left a message, reminding me to eat well. Just as she was about to say something, I took the note off and tossed it away. She immediately closed her mouth and quietly ate. Evan came to pick me up after work, as if he had no job of his own. His car parked at the entrance, and my coworkers couldn't hide their envy, saying I had the perfect husband. I waved goodbye to them and got into the back seat. Evan handed me a warm drink. I heard you coughed a bit yesterday. Thanks. I took it and placed it by the car door. We acted as if nothing had happened, keeping up a polite facade until we got home. When we reached the door, Evan didn't follow right away. Only when I reached the front steps did he catch up, carrying the thermos he'd given me earlier. Oh, sorry, I left it by the side door and forgot about it. Evan didn't respond, just stood there at the bottom of the steps looking up at me. He was backlit, his face hidden in shadow, unreadable. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Lila, You haven't mentioned divorce because you still care about me, right? I shifted my gaze away from his face, looking into empty space. You're wrong, I answered with a smile. Why did you have to push me? Why force me to spell it out that I didn't love you anymore? Why tear away the mask of adult civility, hiding all the ties and entanglements? The love I'd once had for Evan died the day I read that post. Without love, marriage or divorce was merely a calculation of benefits. In the end, without interest in anyone else, staying married to Evan offered me the most advantage. The connections, the resources Evan could provide were the reasons I stayed. Businessmen chase profit. If love requires sincerity, free of any interests, then once love fades, all that remains with Evan is calculation. I looked at Evan and smiled. My gaze didn't waver. I'm just putting things to their best use. Don't you get it, Evan? Our marriage lost its love long ago. All that's left is the semblance of harmony, masking estranged calculations, remorseful attempts to appease, a relationship held together solely by the cold framework of the law. Evan stumbled back slightly. I thought he'd get angry, that he'd lose his temper. But he didn't. Instead, he seemed to take a deep breath, forcefully swallowing all his emotions. His voice was soft, like the flutter of a butterfly's wings, so delicate it seemed it could snap at the lightest touch. It's fine, as long as you don't mention divorce. For now, I won't. I smiled, mercilessly snapping the butterfly's wings. But if I meet someone who moves me again, I can't say for sure. No, you can't. Evan's composure shattered instantly. You can't do this. I love you. You can't love anyone else. Lila, I had no love for anyone else. Lila, I had no interest in watching you lose control. I opened the front door and walked inside. Evan, don't go mad. Love isn't something you can control, but there's no reason to keep clinging after being hurt. The 10 years I spent silently loving Evan were real. But no one knows better than I do. Before you love someone else, you need to love yourself first. If I truly loved you to the point of losing all reason, I wouldn't have chosen my future without hesitation when I went abroad. The path of love is rough, it's easy to stumble, but I'll always have the courage to love again, and the resolve not to look back because the person I love most is always myself. Asterisk, asterisk, epilogue, asterisk, asterisk. Evan, burning with fever, called Lila. Call after call, all he heard was a busy tone. Sorry, the number you dialed is currently busy. He hung up, called again, hung up, called again. He just couldn't get through. In his fevered haze, his phone slipped from his hand onto the floor. He didn't even know if his last call went through. When he woke up, he was in the hospital. Evan blinked at the white walls, dazed for a long time. Suddenly, someone spoke next to him. You're awake? It was Lila. She reached out, feeling his forehead for temperature, then poured him a glass of water. For a moment, Evan thought he was dreaming until he felt the cold touch on his forehead. He tried to speak, but his throat burned. Taking the water from Lila, he drank and felt a bit better. It had been a long time since he'd seen this side of Lila. At home, the two of them were like strangers sharing an apartment. Even when Lila's demeanor was gentle, he knew it was just the courtesy one extends to an acquaintance. Lila, he spoke quickly, wanting to ask if she'd gotten his calls, if she'd brought him to the hospital, if she'd stayed by his bedside for a long time. But before he could finish, Lila interrupted. Are you hungry? What would you like to eat? Pork rib soup. He said it on purpose. Back when Lila was sick, he'd always make pork rib soup for her. Eventually, Lila had insisted on learning to make it herself, saying that when he fell ill, she could take care of him in return. He'd finally given in and taught her. He mentioned it now, hoping to stir something in her. But Lila didn't miss a beat on her phone screen, only nodded. I placed the order. It should be here soon. Evan froze for a moment. He'd hoped she'd make it for him herself. Lila stood up. If you need anything, just press the call button. The food will be here shortly. Evan stared at her, momentarily lost. Where are you going? I have a meeting in the afternoon, so I'll be heading out. With a slight nod, Lila walked towards the door. Evan wanted to call after her. The lingering fever muddled his mind. He reached out and caught the hem of Lila's shirt. Lila looked back at him. Could you stay with me? He knew he'd said the wrong thing because Lila's expression changed instantly, but she maintained her composure. Sorry, the meeting is important. 8. What meeting could be more important than a sick person? He wanted to ask her. He wanted to say, "You didn't used to be like this." He wanted to remind her that she'd once promised to take good care of him. He even wanted to say, you said that you loved me." But he couldn't say a word. The last shreds of his reason reminded him that he was to blame for ruining everything. He released her shirt. "Sorry. Go on then." In the beginning, Evan thought it was fine as long as they hadn't divorced. As long as they were still married, he still had time to win Lila back. After all, she used to love him so deeply. But later he realized he'd been wrong. Lila didn't accept his attempts at reconciliation. In public, they still acted like a loving couple, but behind closed doors, they were polite cohabitants. Lila never ate the breakfast Evan prepared. When he gave her gifts, she occasionally reciprocated, but her return gifts seemed hastily chosen, devoid of thought. He thought it was okay, believing that one day he'd win her over. But the more he tried, the colder she became. Returning from a party or his parents' house was always the hardest for Evan. The contrast hit the hardest then. The smile that had just graced her face would vanish as she slipped her hand out of his, the warmth lingering in his arm fading away. He'd argued before. He'd broken down countless times. He'd let Lila curse him. He'd gripped her hand, begging her, even slapping himself. He'd looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, pleading for her to hate him. But Lila simply pulled her hand free, sighing softly. "Don't make a fuss." Her gaze was calm, and he felt like a criminal laid bare. From beginning to end, he'd been the one making a scene. It was then he understood. Remorse and anguish meant nothing. Lila would never turn back, so he kept telling himself, as long as Lila doesn't divorce me, it would be enough. Even if she was just using me, just calculating against me, even if there was no love, that would be fine. As long as she was willing to stay by my side, to remain my wife in name. It was enough. But that promise of hers hovered above him like a sword, always threatening to fall. He never knew when it would drop, and he was constantly haunted by the fear of that moment. What he couldn't bear, the thing he feared most, was the thought of her loving someone else. Evan stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Lila didn't come the second day. When he finally returned home, Lila was nowhere to be found. He sent her a message and hours later received a reply saying she was on a business trip. The last time they'd spoken had been half a month ago. Evan had asked if she was free. He had 2 tickets to a musical from a friend. "I don't enjoy musicals. Sorry." He stared at that message for a long time. She used to go with him. Afterward, they'd walk back together, Lila's hand on his arm, her steps light. Evan would look at her and smile. Today was great. It wasn't the musical that made her happy. It was being together. Evan hesitated, typing and deleting his message in the chat for a while, finally sending, "I'm out of the hospital." After a moment, he retracted it and replaced it with, "Safe travels." There was no reply. Evan sighed and set down his phone. The city buzzed in the evening, lights shining from every home. People were returning from work, the smell of food wafting through the air, accompanied by the laughter of families. Evan didn't turn on the lights. He sat alone in the dark. Suddenly, he felt the emptiness of his home. He'd never noticed it before. When Lila wasn't busy, she liked curling up on the sofa to watch anime. It seemed like a habit he had picked up when she stayed at his place before. After Lila came back from studying abroad, he once felt she had matured, that she was somewhat unfamiliar to him, but soon he realized she hadn't changed at all. She still loved watching anime, still called him brother, laughed out loud when she was happy, and could be easily cheered up when she was sad. In truth, Evan was glad. At the office, Lila was sharp and capable. Everyone praised her independence. But only he knew. His little girl could still be playful, watch kids' anime, and laugh and cry over the characters. Only he knew. He used to feel immense satisfaction. Only he knew this side of Lila. The night Lila returned from her business trip, she hadn't told him her arrival time. It was by chance that Evan ran into her downstairs. He saw Lila standing face to face with another man. The two were chatting, and Lila had an expression he hadn't seen in ages, lively and radiant. The man with a typically indifferent look seemed to soften in Lila's presence, his gaze subtly gentle. Even though they weren't standing close, there was a natural harmony between them, a sense of exclusivity that no outsider could intrude upon. Evan suddenly felt a surge of anger. A pang of bitterness he couldn't identify filled his chest. It even made him want to rush over and punch the man in the face. But he knew that would make Lila angry. He wanted to walk over, wrap his arm around her shoulder, and declare, "Thank you for bringing my wife back." But his feet were glued to the spot, unable to move. Beyond the anger, a wave of panic hit him even harder. The sword was hanging by a thread. Could it be him? That man? Could it be him? Lila said goodbye and turned to walk in his direction. Before his mind could react, Evan's body had already turned, heading home. When Lila opened the door, he was waiting with a pale face and forced a smile at her. He chose to avoid the confrontation. While Lila was in the shower, he checked her chat history. He knew it was despicable, but he couldn't help it. He just couldn't accept it. He couldn't accept the idea of Lila loving someone else. Lila's phone still had the same pattern password as before. It hadn't changed, and he unlocked it easily. At the top was her friend, Anna. He opened the chat and glanced through it. "Anna, hurry up and divorce, please. I feel like stabbing your husband twice, just from looking at him." Lila replied with a laughing emoji. "What type do you like? I'll introduce someone to you. Lars isn't bad, you know." She replied with another emoji. Evan exited the chat and found Lars's account. Lila's note was simple, just Lars, with nothing suggesting intimacy. He opened the chat, and the latest message was from Lila. "Thanks for dropping me off," Lars had replied politely. "It's no trouble." The sound of water running in the bathroom continued. Evan scrolled furiously through their messages. They had been chatting frequently, mostly about work, with the occasional restrained show of concern. Both of them had been careful to stay within boundaries. No one crossed the line. In his dazed state, a new message from Lars popped up. "I managed to get 2 tickets for the XX exhibition." Evan knew XX2. It was Lila's favorite anime. He could already guess what Lars would say next. Driven by anger, he nearly wanted to reply, "No, you can't." But the next message popped up. And it wasn't, "Let's go together." Instead, it said, "Feel free to go with a friend." Evan stood frozen. He would have preferred if their chat had been full of flirtatious, suggestive words. Or if Lars, knowing she was married, had still invited her, deliberately crossing the line. Or even if Lila, in a fit of resentment, had decided to cheat to get back at him. That way at least they would be even, and he wouldn't hold her faults against her, as long as they could go back to the way things were. But the more they kept their distance, the uglier he felt. The more they stayed respectful, the more he saw himself as despicable. "Look," he thought, "only I have done anything wrong. Only I am the disgraceful one." Maybe Lila realized he had looked at her phone, but she didn't confront him. Evan spent every day in trepidation. The feeling that he was losing her grew stronger and stronger, and he was powerless to stop it. No matter how kind he was to Lila, it was like throwing a pebble into the sea, with no response in return. On a bright sunny afternoon, Lila brought up divorce. She came with the divorce papers, sitting across from him, smiling calmly. Divorce papers. She sat across from him, smiling calmly. "Let's get divorced." It had finally fallen. In that moment, the sword hanging above his head fell, slicing through him from top to bottom. His heart, now on the left half of his body, beat slower and slower, and blood spilled everywhere. It was as if he was truly experiencing the pain of a heart attack. Of death, even breathing became difficult. Is it him? It took him a while to find his voice again, but it sounded shrill, unlike his own. "Who? Lars. Did you fall in love with him? Is that it?" Lila was briefly surprised, then shook her head. "No, I didn't fall in love with him. I just wanted to give him a chance." Lila smiled. "To give myself a chance and him one too. After all, before starting a new relationship, isn't it necessary to close off the old one completely?" Evan felt as if something had gripped his throat. He wanted to tear the divorce agreement in front of him into pieces, but after a long while, he simply said, I understand. I'll sign the divorce papers after I review them. Lila was momentarily surprised, then genuinely smiled, pleased. Good. I'll wait for you. He wanted to cling to her, but he feared she would be annoyed. So let it be. At least in the end, I would leave her with a decently graceful exit. Evan made some adjustments to the divorce agreement, giving most of the assets to Lila. She called him to ask, It's compensation. The person on the other end chuckled, not saying anything. That was just an excuse. He only wanted to leave her with a good impression at their final parting. Even though things had already fallen apart between them, the day they picked up the divorce certificates, Lila arrived alone and left alone as well. As Evan stood by the door, he asked, Should I give you a ride? Lila shook her head and said calmly, I'll walk. Anna is waiting for me. Evan watched her silhouette grow smaller as she walked away, until she disappeared from sight. It was a perfectly nice day, but he just felt terrible. Utterly, utterly terrible. He had wanted to ask her a question. Had she ever resented him? But in truth, there was no need to ask. She wouldn't care. Perhaps she'd never waste her time on something so pointless. Like the year he brought fruit over to Lila's house, only to overhear her mother asking, Have you made up your mind? Are you really going abroad? What about the person you like? Are you willing to leave him? Lila had laughed then, her youthful voice sweet and bright. Mom, if it doesn't involve my family, then to me, my future has never been a multiple choice question. She had always been this resolute.